According to legend, Pennyland was one of Canada's most popular amusement parks. During the 25 years it was open, over 200,000 people walked through its gates to enjoy rides and amusements. However, there was a terrible incident on a Ferris wheel, and several people were killed. Pennyland was forced to shut down, and most of the rides were dismantled. The remaining ones were abandoned and left to fall into disrepair. Years later, police were called when a dead body was found on the grounds of the old amusement park. A homeless man had collapsed and died of a drug overdose in the toilets. Following procedure, the police made a routine search of the grounds. What they found horrified them. In the building that housed the old Ferris wheel, they discovered 2 rotting corpses. It was the remains of 2 young girls. The policeman who came across the bodies was severely traumatized and left the force soon afterwards. One night, a teenage boy was passing by the abandoned amusement park when he noticed that some of the lights were on. Curious, he decided to go investigate. As he drew closer to one of the buildings, a girl suddenly appeared at the window. There were cuts all over her face and she was covered in blood. The teenager was about to go inside to help her when a strange man emerged from the doorway. He was carrying a bloody knife. Frightened, the boy began backing away. The crazed man rushed towards him. Suddenly all the lights went out and the building plunged into darkness. Scrambling around, looking for something to use to defend himself, the boy picked up a metal pipe. Gripping it tightly, he swung around, ready to fight for his life. Just then, the lights came back on, and he was shocked to discover that the man and the girl were gone. All that was left was a bloody handprint on the window. La Mala Hora is said to be a wicked spirit or an evil demon that wanders the lonely country roads after midnight and terrorizes those who travel alone. It usually lurks in the darkness at crossroads, waiting for an unwary traveler to cross its path. According to some, it is more feared than the devil. It appears as a large black lump, constantly moving and changing shape. It can also change size rapidly, growing larger and smaller. They said it looks like a ghostly black shroud or a large black cotton ball. Anyone who is unfortunate enough to set eyes on this demon runs the risk of being driven insane. When it attacks, it suddenly rushes towards the unwary and suffocates them. The following morning, the poor person is found dead at the side of the road. At other times, it transforms into a wicked woman, a female personification of evil. She appears wearing black clothing, her hair long and unkempt. She is like a spirit or wind floating along without touching the ground with her feet. People in New Mexico say that she seldom appears in human form, but when she does, it is considered to be a death omen. If you encounter her at a crossroads, it usually means that you or somebody you know is going to die. When pressed for more detailed information about this demon, the people of New Mexico will refuse to talk about it and just reply, "It's an evil thing." In one story, there was a woman whose husband was always away on business trips. One night, she decided to go stay with her friend in Santa Fe. It was just after midnight when she left her house and drove down the lonely, deserted highway. After a while, she approached a small crossroads when suddenly a dark shape appeared in front of her car. The woman screamed in fright and slammed on the brakes, screeching to a halt. When she looked up again, the dark shape had disappeared. For a second, the woman breathed a sigh of relief. Then she turned to her right and saw something that almost gave her a heart attack. Right beside her window, looking at her, was a hideous old lady. She had the twisted face of a demon, glowing red eyes, and short pointed teeth. The demonic lady began clawing at the window, trying to break the glass. Terrified, the woman put her foot down on the accelerator, and the car took off down the road. For a few terrible moments, the demonic lady ran alongside the car, still clawing at the window. Then the car sped up and she fell behind. The woman looked in her rearview mirror. The last thing she saw was the demon growing taller and taller until it was as large as a tree. When the woman reached her friend's house, she ran inside and locked the door behind her. The woman had explained what she had seen at the crossroads, and her friend gasped in horror. "It must have been La Mala Hora," said her friend, "the evil one. They say she only appears at crossroads when someone is about to die." The woman was overcome by a feeling of dread and impending doom. She couldn't sleep a wink that night. She waited until morning, then drove home. She made sure not to drive by the crossroads again, fearing that the demonic lady would appear once more. When the woman reached home, she found a police car waiting in her driveway. The officers approached her, asked her name, and broke the terrible news to her. Her husband had been mugged on the way back to his hotel the night before. He had been shot in the head and was killed instantly. It all happened just after midnight. Years ago, there was a road that was known by the locals as the Neverending Road. Some say it was Lester Road in Corona, California, and others maintain it was Hot Springs Road in Alberta, Canada. It was a long, winding road, unlit and bordered by thick forests that led through the mountains. According to legend, many people who drove down the road at night were never seen or heard from again. The legend of the Neverending Road became so well known that a lot of folks were even afraid to drive on it during the daylight hours. Some drivers would even lose their nerve and turn back, terrified that if they continued along the road, that they would never return. The road took a sharp turn at one point and curved around a large canyon. There was no guardrails on the turn, and on the other side of the canyon, the road continued. One summer, a work crew were widening the road when they made a gruesome discovery. One of the workmen pushed a rock over to the side of the canyon and heard it hit something metal. When they climbed down to look, the workmen found dozens of crashed cars at the bottom. They had all fallen to their doom, and the decomposing bodies and skeletal remains of the victims were still strapped into the seats. It was discovered that the roads on either side of the canyon lined up so well that when viewed from the correct angle, especially at night, it created an optical illusion. The canyon was almost invisible, and the road seemed to continue on up and over the hill on the other side of the canyon. People who drove down the road at night had no idea that there was a huge drop in front of them until it was too late, and they careened off the cliff and plummeted to their deaths. They say that local law enforcement hushed up the discovery, wanting to avoid a scandal, and the road was quietly closed down, never to be reopened. The corpses of the dead were never able to be recovered, and they still lie there to this day in their twisted metal graves. One night, a teenage girl went to a nightclub with her friends. They had a great time drinking and dancing. It was 3 a.m. by the time they left. Her friends lived in the city, but the girl lived in the suburbs. They said goodbye and went back to their apartment, leaving the girl to make her own way home. Unable to get a taxi, the teenage girl decided to walk home on her own. On the way, she had to cross through a park. It was very dark, and all she could hear was the clacking of her heels echoing in the night. She thought she saw something moving in the bushes, so she quickened her pace. Suddenly, a man appeared from behind a bush and blocked her path. His face was hideous. It looked terribly scarred and misshaped. She tried to run, but he cornered her and grabbed hold of her arms. The frightened girl pleaded for her life and tearfully asked to be let go. The man's deformed mouth twisted into a leering grin. "Do you want death or a smiley face?" he asked. "Please let me go," she cried. "Death or a smiley face?" he insisted. The girl didn't know what he meant. "Smiley face," she replied. Without a word, he pulled out his knife and sliced the corners of the girl's mouth up to her ears. Her face was left completely deformed, and she was scarred for life. Whenever people saw her in public, they said she resembled a grotesque smiley face. A young man and his wife were on a trip to visit his mother. Usually, they arrived in time for supper. They had gotten a late start, and now it was getting dark. They decided to look for a place to stay overnight and go on in the morning. Just off the road, they saw a small house in the woods. "Maybe they rent rooms," the wife said, so they stopped to ask. An elderly man and a woman came to the door. They didn't rent rooms, they said, but they would be glad to have them stay overnight as their guests. They had plenty of room, and they would enjoy the company. The old woman made coffee, brought out some cake, and the four of them talked for a while. Then the young couple were taken to their room. They explained that they wanted to pay for this, but the old man said he would not accept any money. The young couple got up early the next morning before their host had awakened. On the table, near the front door, they left an envelope with some money in it for the room. Then they went to the next town. They stopped at a restaurant and had breakfast. When they told the owner where they stayed, he was shocked. "That can't be," he said. "That house burned to the ground 10 years ago. The old man and woman who lived there died in the fire." The young couple couldn't believe it, so they went back to the house. Only now there was no house. All they found was a burned out shell. They stood staring at the remains, trying to understand what had happened. Then the woman started screaming. In the rubble was a badly burned table. On the table was the envelope that they had left there that morning. There was a young woman who had just started a new job in a large office building. She was walking to work one day when a long black hearse drove up slowly next to her, matching her pace. This made her nervous, and she anxiously watched it out of the corner of her eye. The driver leaned out the window and called to her in a deep, booming voice, "Do you need a lift?" She turned to look at him and got a terrible shock. The driver's face was incredibly hideous and deformed. His skin was deathly pale, and one of his eyes was noticeably higher than the other. The man pointed to the rear of the vehicle, which contained a coffin. "Room for one more," he said, frightened by his bizarre appearance and unwelcome suggestion. She refused his offer of the lift. Profoundly disturbed, the woman ran down the street until she came to the office building where she worked. For the rest of the day, she couldn't stop thinking about the strange man in the hearse and was glad when work was finally over. The woman worked up on the 9th floor, and when the elevator came, it was almost completely full. She hesitated before stepping in. "Are you sure you don't want to come in?" asked a familiar, booming voice. "There's room for one more." The woman gasped. It was the hearse driver from this morning, eyeing her with his lopsided, horrible gaze. Now thoroughly spooked, the woman backed away, stuttering, I think I'll take the stairs." The hearse driver just stared at her as the door slid closed. The woman had only taken a few steps down the stairs when she heard a chorus of screams followed by a deafening crash. She hurried downstairs and discovered that the elevator cable had broken and all the passengers aboard had plunged to their grisly death. A young couple got married, and after the wedding they held a reception in the bride's grandmother's house. All their family and friends arrived, and they laughed, danced, and sang long into the night. After the wedding reception, the guests decided to play a game of hide and seek. The groom covered his eyes and began counting to 100, while his new bride and the other guests ran out of the room looking for somewhere to hide. Eventually, the groom had found everyone except his beautiful bride. The other guests began calling out her name and searched everywhere for the young woman. They began to grow more and more uneasy when they couldn't find any trace of her. Eventually, they gave up searching, and everybody assumed that the girl had run away and left her husband. After weeks went by, the husband accepted that his beautiful bride must have had second thoughts about their marriage. He decided to forget about her and go on with his life. A few years later, a cleaning lady was dusting in the attic when she came across an old trunk. Out of curiosity, she opened it. Inside the trunk, she found the rotting corpse of a young woman. still dressed in a bridal gown. There was a wedding ring on one bony finger. It was the missing bride. She must have hidden in the trunk and accidentally locked herself inside. It was impossible to tell whether she had suffocated or starved to death, but her face was frozen in a silent scream. They say the ghost of a girl with no head haunts Big Black Mountain in Harlan County, Kentucky. The locals call her Headless Annie. Many years ago, Kentucky was coal mining country, and Harlan County was where most of the mining camps were set up. There was a huge demand for coal, and just about every able-bodied man in the area was hired to work in the coal mines. However, at the time, being a miner was very dangerous, and the men started going on strike to force their bosses to increase their pay. The bosses responded by killing some of the miners on the picket lines, and Harlan County became known as Bloody Harlan. According to the legend, around this time, there was a 12-year-old girl named Annie who lived on Big Black Mountain. Her father worked in the mines, and he became very outspoken about wanting the workers to form a union. He became a thorn in the side of the mining companies, and they wanted to make an example of him so that nobody else would dare cross them. One night, the bosses sent a group of thugs out on Big Black Mountain. They dragged Annie and her father and mother out of bed and led them into the forest. First, they made Annie and her mother watch as they cut her father's legs. Then, they hung his body on a meat hook that they tied high up in a tree so that he could bleed to death like a slaughtered pig. Annie was forced to watch as they murdered her mother in the same grisly fashion. Then, it was Annie's turn. The men chopped off her head and threw her body off a huge cliff that runs alongside of the road. She lay there, undiscovered for days, while wild animals feasted on her carcass. Her murderers were never brought to justice. If you're on Big Black Mountain after dark, around the same time she died, they say that you can see the ghost of Headless Annie wandering down the road. Some people claim to have seen her headless figure, dressed in a nightgown and surrounded by an unearthly glow. They say that when you pass by, she jumps onto the hood of your car and causes the engine to stall. Then, she checks to see if any of the windows are down. If she finds an open window, she will try to reach in and take your head. Boy Scout Lane is a haunted road in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. The road got its name because of a tragic event that occurred there. According to local legend, during the 1950s, a Boy Scout troop visited the area on an expedition where they had hoped to earn a number of their merit badges. They arrived in a bus and parked on the road. Then they set up camp in the woods. All of the Boy Scouts mysteriously disappeared on this road and were never seen again. Nobody knows what happened to them. They just vanished mysteriously without explanation and were never found. Some say that the Boy Scouts were murdered one by one that night in their sleep by the bus driver who had gone insane. Others believe the Boy Scouts left their camp during the night and accidentally dropped their lantern, causing a forest fire that killed the entire troop. 2 Boy Scouts escaped the fate of the rest of the troop and set out to find help, only to become lost in the woods, where they died of starvation. The ghosts of the Boy Scouts now haunt the forest where they died. They can be heard hiking through the undergrowth. The lights from their lanterns have been seen at night as they try to find help or search for their fellow scouts. People who explore the woods around Boy Scout Lane say that they have experienced a strong sense of foreboding and the sensation that they are being watched. They have heard the sound of footsteps and breaking branches coming from all around them. Others have seen unusual red or white lights swinging through the trees. Some of them have even reported seeing a ghostly bus filled with transparent figures of children. During the American Civil War, there was a road in Texas between Groves and Port Neches. A woman named Sarah Jane lived on this road. Her husband was away fighting in the war as a Confederate soldier. When enemy soldiers were passing through the area, Sarah Jane feared that they would kill her and her baby. She went down to the river and placed her small infant in a wicker basket. Then, Sarah hid the baby under the bridge to protect the child. Sarah made her way back down the road to her home and waited for the Union soldiers to arrive. After the soldiers passed by, she went back to the bridge to retrieve her baby. Unfortunately, the baby was nowhere to be found. The tide had risen and carried the baby away downstream. Sarah Jane searched through the night down the banks of the Neches River for hours in hopes of finding her baby safe and sound. Neighbors could hear Sarah Jane scream as she searched, and she kept running up to people, weeping pitifully and asking, "Have you seen my baby?" Grief-stricken and unable to find her child, Sarah Jane walked back to the bridge and hung herself from the wooden beams beneath it. When people found her body, they saw the message scratched into the wood under the bridge that read, "Where is my baby?" As the story goes, if you go out to Sarah Jane Road at night and stand there on the water's edge, you can still hear Sarah Jane's baby crying off in the distance. Some people claim that they've spotted a noose hanging beneath the bridge. Others say that they've also seen Sarah Jane's ghost searching alongside of the river for an infant child she lost so many years ago. Locals say you can stand in the middle of the bridge on a dark night and call for the ghost of Sarah Jane to appear. You have to repeat it 7 times. "I've got your baby, Sarah Jane."